Welcome to Bunny Trails, a whimsical adventure of idioms and other turns of phrase. I'm Shauna Harrison.
And I'm Dan Pugh. Each week, we take an idiom or other turn of phrase and try to tell the story from its entry into the English language to how it's used today. You know when you are just trying to get by in life and something happens and forces you to make a choice? And you know that choice will likely lead down two different paths, and you just don't know which path will be best. Maybe you use all of the available information and boldly make a decision. Or maybe you sit down and cry. Both are viable options. Most of us will do something in between, maybe cry while we choose the path that seems less dreary and hope it works out. But that choice we had to make is often represented in the saying, a fork in the road. So according to Cambridge Dictionary, fork in the road means, quote, a situation in which something can develop in one of two possible ways, and you have to make a choice, end quote.
Yeah.
So a fork in the road has a similar meaning to the phrase at a crossroads, which we discussed in episode 187. So if you're interested in that, you can go back and take a listen to that one too after you get done listening to this. So this concept of a fork in the road is often portrayed as a path one is walking, and that path goes in two different ways. Sometimes there are markings that might give a clue as to which way the traveler should go, and sometimes there is no guide. Many times when I've seen this portrayed, the viewer has a higher vantage point, like an eye in the sky, and we can see the right direction, right? So we can see that one way leads to doom and gloom, and the other one leads to a good, a good path. But the
Right.
traveler does not have that same clarity as they stand at the fork. And there's a reason why we call such a thing a fork, and it is an old reason.
Okay.
According to the Oxford English Dictionary, in Old English, a fork was, quote, an implement, chiefly agricultural, consisting of a long straight handle, furnished at the end with two or more prongs or tines, and used for carrying, digging, lifting, throwing, and also the word prefixed indicating its use, like pitchfork, hayfork, or dung fork, end quote.
Okay.
So, agricultural, mostly, these forked instruments have parts that branch off from one another. And by the late 1300s, we see examples of forked items in print, like sticks with forked ends that are used in gardening as well. So, one example from the Helmingham manuscript in 1389 refers to the forked sticks being used to hold up vines. So we definitely see it going from Old English, where it was an intentional tool, to one where we kind of found anything that would work as a fork in this situation. In 1398, there's an example of a fork being used as a verb, which leads to this definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, quote, a forking, bifurcation, or division into branches, the point at which anything forks, end quote. And then we move swiftly from that verbifying of fork, into, quote, to form a fork, to divide into branches, to divaricate. So these are both ways that we see fork being used, and where we start seeing in the late 1300s where it starts moving into anything that branches out or has a bifurcation, moves in two different ways.
Okay. Yeah.
So, or divides into branches at all, so it doesn't necessarily have to be two of them necessarily. And of course, this is the concept by which we get the eating utensil called a fork, because early forks had two branches. And in relation to eating utensils, the Oxford English Dictionary has examples from the late 1400s and onwards of those pieces. So fork has obviously predated the actual fork itself that we think of that we would eat with. But this leads us to a straightforward concept of a fork in a road, because the road divides into branches and you have to decide which way to go. Now, it's not easy to track down when a fork was first assigned to a road. I know General George Washington used the term in a June 9th, 1780 letter issuing orders to his troops. Now, I highly doubt it took until 1780 before we began using the phrase to refer to forks in roads or forks in rivers in a literal sense. But what about the metaphorical example? Because that is the phrase that we are talking about today. One of the first times I could find fork in the road being used as a metaphor was in the 1807 work, The Kentucky Revival, or A Short History of the Late Extraordinary Outpouring of the Spirit of God in the Western States of America, agreeable to Scripture purposes and prophecies concerning the latter day, by Richard McNamara. Back in those time frames, you could use the Kentucky Revival, or you could put the entire synopsis in the title as well.
Yeah, you just want to let people know what they're getting.
So, in it, the author talks about a doctor who was a very wicked man. Then, while attending to people during a time of general sickness, he was struck with a deep sense of his own sins. A good spirit showed him a vision in which the doctor was on a road that had two paths. He could go right towards happiness, or he could go left towards misery. Quote, this fork in the road, he was told, represented that stage of life in which people were convicted of sin, and those who took the right hand way quit everything that was wicked and became good. But the left hand was for such as would go on and be bad after they were shown the right way. End quote.
Okay.
So that's the first time I could find it being used metaphorically, 1807. And this is a pretty common tale for the time. A missionary shows you the path of righteousness, and now you have a decision to make, mend your ways or face eternal doom. All right, I also saw it in a parable story in the December 1864 edition of The Sower, a monthly magazine. In it, two boys are traveling home when they come to a fork in the road. Quote, the mare set briskly off and was soon lost to sight among the winding of the forest. But the gloom gathered faster than the horse trotted, and it was quite dark when they reached a fork in the road, where it might make a considerable difference which path they took home. One was a traveled road. This way there was a good bridge over Bounding Brook, a mountain stream, which was often dangerously swelled by the spring rains. It was the safest, though the longest way home. The other was a wood path through the pines, often taken in good weather by farmers living on the east side of town to shorten the distance to the corner. In this road, Bounding Brook was crossed by fording. End quote. So that was kind of the setup that they laid out, and you can see how they've explained this whole metaphorical concept that they have reaching the fork in the road. And it's an interesting parable as both boys intend to take the well-traveled path, but when they arrive, it's unclear to them which is the correct path. And the oldest boy wants to follow his gut, while the youngest wants to go towards a cabin light and ask the residents for clarification. The oldest, full of pride, declares he is certain of the correct way, and the youngest declares his honest certainty is unhelpful if he's wrong. And as you might imagine, they chose the wrong path and narrowly avoid death. The moral was that a man can be wrong and only the word of God alone is infallible. It's a stretch to get there, though, frankly, because in this story, the fork in the road represents when they should look to the word of God. But to be honest, unless God was going to appear to them with a vision, I'm not sure how they would have done something other than trust someone's judgment, either the oldest boy's judgment or trust the judgment of the residents of the cabin, right? Presumably, it wasn't God in the cabin. So, but me not understanding the parable isn't the point, I guess. The point is this is another fork in the road that is a literal usage, but with an illusionary meaning. So it's used in both a literal sense. There's a literal fork in the road, but that fork in the road is also representative of a tough decision that one has to make.
Right.
Here's another concept. This is an example of an advertisement with a spin on coming to a fork on the road. This is an ad for the new walkover shoes, and they were sold in Bennington by E.E. Hart. The ad is in the October 7th, 1905 edition of the Bennington Evening Banner out of Vermont, USA. Quote, if you come to a fork in the road where there was no guide board, how would you decide which was the direct way to your destination? Guess at it and probably go wrong, or ask someone who knew, who had been over the road, and go right the first time. A man was facing a fork in the road, trying to decide what make of shoes was the direct way to comfort. He asked someone who knew, who had been over the road. He was told the walkover way is the straight way. Now he's telling others. End quote.
Oh my.
Yeah, I feel like the seller's trying a little too hard with his story there, but
Uh,
I applaud the effort nonetheless.
yeah.
Uh, felt
Yeah.
a little bit too.
Like a little on the nose. Yeah.
Yeah. The next one is from the Free Trader Journal out of Ottawa, Illinois, and it is dated June 1st, 1920. It is a public notice from the Public Service Company of Northern Illinois, and it is listing how many places in Illinois have experienced water rate hikes of up to 150% in the last few years. Then it goes on to note how the cost of almost everything has risen and how they haven't raised their rates since 1914. And now they're asking for a 30% increase, which, it clearly is better than the 150% the other areas of Illinois, USA have been raising the prices. So here is their public notice. Quote, every community we serve is concerned in the company's growth and in the efficient performance of its duties. But we have reached a fork in the road, not of our own making. As much as we might wish to leave our rate record undisturbed, this is impossible if the essential service of the company is to be done properly. To achieve this, we must have the advance in rates we ask. End quote. I appreciate the fact that they're only asking for a 30% increase when everybody else has increased it more.
Right.
Someone is lining their pockets
Yeah.
with money.
Yeah.
Okay, this next one is from 1943, and it sounds suspiciously like today's statements. This is from the Brewery Gulch Gazette out of Bisbee, Arizona, and it is dated July 29th, 1943. This is from a piece called A Fork in the Road by George Peck. Quote, the piece will find us at the fork of the road. One signpost will read, this road is a rocky one. It is paved with thrift and economy. It's uphill all the way, but it can be traveled, and it eventually will bring you to that desirable destination of balanced budgets, debt redemption, democracy, and freedom. The other signpost reads, this road is a smooth one. It is paved with waste and sloth. It's downhill all the way. It's easy to travel, but it finally will bring you to the most undesirable destination of unbalanced budgets, debt repudiation, dictatorship, and slavery. Which fork will we take?
Wow.
End quote. Yeah. So, that felt very much like what Starship Troopers or the current video game Helldivers 2 talks about when they say democracy and freedom. I'm like, there's no tie to what he's talking about that also ties to democracy and freedom, or for that matter, dictatorship and slavery either, really.
Right.
Neither of those two things are, so like, it's just kind of apropos of nothing. He slapped them on there. But he does make austerity measures, which is the thrift and economy he's talking about. He makes those sound horrible, and he makes the smooth road sound like the cool, good road. I know it said waste and sloth, but sloths are like the coolest of animals.
They are pretty
right?
cool.
And I would prefer a smooth downhill road to a rough uphill road.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we do have the historical record to guide us here, showing we did not abandon the Social Security in the post-war period, as was mentioned as part of the article. That's what one of the things they wanted to see, was to abandon this whole Social Security thing that we were building as part of FDR's take during World War II. They wanted to get rid of this. And since this article was written, the United States have been through over 80 years of not being a dictatorship, with only one small, relatively recent blip on the record of peaceful transitions. And while we still have an unbalanced budget and we are still not providing enough basic support to cover all of our citizenry, we have seen record growth in our economy, and American lives on the average are doing better in almost every measurable area. I'll link to a good article about why it doesn't always feel like things are going better, and that'll be free on our Patreon, patreon.com/bunnytrailspod. This article mentions that there are some huge worldwide obstacles to tackle, but instead of facing those head on, as we Americans would usually tout as the American way, where we're going to go straight at a problem,
Right.
the government of the United States has battened down the hatches in favor of austerity, and it looks as if in 2025 we are in fact choosing Peck's uphill road. And so we will have to check back with you in another 80 years to see where that decision leads, or if we stay on that uphill road. In 1965, the Motown group The Miracles released a song called A Fork in the Road. It was written by Smokey Robinson, Pete Moore, and Ronnie White, who were all members of the group The Miracles. And here are the opening lyrics. Quote, "Beware, beware, beware. Seems like love should be easy to bear, but it's such a heavy load. Worldwide traveler, you ain't been nowhere till you've traveled down love's road. I know I may just be a stranger. Lover, let me warn you there's the danger of the fork in love's road." End quote. Now you have to imagine
Okay.
me saying that as Smokey Robinson would have sang it, so about 17 octaves higher than what I did. Uh, but Smokey Robinson was, I think, when they wrote this song, he was like 16. So yeah, it's amazing. These guys were so talented.
Yeah. That is it is impressive to have that kind of like an insight and also applying that skillfully
Right.
to with your talents is just really impressive and at a young age. So
Yeah, I mean the person that springs to mind of today's generation that did that at that age would have been Taylor Swift, right? So
right.
she was writing songs. She writes most of her songs, if not all of them, and some of her early songs that she wrote in her later teenage years were ones that were like this, very that seemed like they were covering concepts that I certainly didn't feel or understand at the same age.
Right.
It's like they had some sort of an insight into something.
Yes, very much so.
All right, there's one more note before we move on, and this one's from a mistake I have apparently made in my own memory. When I think of a fork in the road, I often think of Robert Frost's 1915 narrative poem, The Road Not Taken. So this poem opens, "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth." End quote. So this poem speaks to how choices are inevitable, and in coming to the point at which the roads diverge, the author faces the same metaphorical decision as in coming to a fork in the road. But the poem never uses the phrase, so while the association with the concept is valid, there's no association with the actual phrase itself in this poem. And
Right.
I just wanted to mention that in case any of you, like me, think of this poem when you think of this phrase, because conceptually it's accurate. That is what he's doing. He's coming to a fork in the road. But the road not taken never actually uses that phrase.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of what, but that is definitely a symbol or in, like that imagery is the one people tie it together.
Exactly, exactly. All right, well, with that, it's time to move to our more modern uses. But first, we need to say thank you to our sponsors.
This episode is sponsored by our amazing patrons on Patreon. And the cool thing about Patreon is it is 100% free to join the community. We have new things every weekday on the feeds. On Mondays, we have a conversation about what movies, shows, books, podcasts, and whatever else everyone is enjoying. Tuesdays see early access to the week's podcast. Wednesdays have all the links, books, songs, and other content mentioned in the week's episode. Thursday has patrons-only polls, and Fridays are our lightly edited behind-the-scenes video featuring all the cut content, goofs, and bonus facts you could imagine.
We've got some other pretty cool stuff too, like original digital artwork once a month made by Shauna, and direct access to talk with us. No algorithms getting in the way of what we see or don't see. Plus, you can get awesome name recognition like Pat Rowe does every episode. And our top spot is currently occupied by the amazing Mary Halsig Lopez. You can join the Bunny Trails community for free at Bunny Trails Pod on Patreon.
That's patreon.com/bunnytrailspod.
All right, I will start with Yogi Berra, who was a well known American baseball player, but he was also a successful author. In 2001, he released a book he co wrote with Dave Kaplan. The title captures so much of who Yogi Berra was. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. Inspiration and wisdom from one of baseball's greatest heroes.
I love Yogi Berra.
Me too. Here's the synopsis of the publisher, Grand Central Publishing. Quote, "An exciting new collection of sublimely simple wisdom from a best-selling author, celebrated athlete, and true American hero. Three-time MVP and Hall of Famer Yogi Berra hit home runs twice in a row with his two previous books, The Yogi Book and It Ain't Over. Now, his winning streak will continue with his latest work, a collection of appealing, funny, and surprisingly moving essays on life, happiness, and getting through the slumps. Filled with another delightful helping of Yogi's imitable and unwittingly wise aphorisms, these reflections focus on the valuable lessons he has learned on and off the field. From his early years as an immigrant son who dropped out of the 8th grade through his triumphant career as a player and manager who played in a record 75 World Series games, Yogi illustrates his homespun philosophies with apt analogies to his trove of baseball stories. He expounds on such topics as patience, waiting for your pitch, sacrifice, laying down a bunt, trusting others, taking direction, and staying focused, keeping your eye on the ball. To show how the rules of life and baseball are uncannily similar. And in the tradition of don't sweat the small stuff and all I really need to know I learned in kindergarten, he explains his recipe for fulfillment and happiness with life lessons that are profoundly simple, simply profound, and classic Yogi to the core. End quote.
Nice.
So in the behind the scenes this week, we're going to explore some of the memorable sayings of Yogi Berra. Here are a few to get you thinking. A nickel ain't worth a dime anymore. It ain't over till it's over. You can't think and hit at the same time. And the future ain't what it used to be. Although we do have to be careful because Berra noted that not everything that is attributed to him was something he said, but he said it just like Yogi, noting, I didn't really say everything I said. This guy, I love him so much.
Amazing.
The behind the scenes video is available to patrons every Friday on our Patreon. That's patreon.com/bunnytrailspod. Fork in the Road is a 2009 song by Neil Young off the album of the same name. It's almost a spoken word kind of song like George Thorogood's Bad to the Bone or One Bourbon, One Scotch, One Beer. And like many of Neil Young's songs, there is an anti-establishment theme. The song was written in 2008, which was when the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, also known as the Wall Street bailouts or bank bailouts, was passed into law, and this gave money to multi-billion-dollar corporations deemed too big to fail. The widespread sentiment was that these corporations were making record profits by doing high-risk things, but then the American taxpayers had to foot the bill to bail them out when their high-risk actions began to cause them financial harms. And because the American way of life is so heavily leveraged in these corporations, Congress felt it was better to bail them out with U.S. taxpayer dollars than to let the economy of the United States tank. Early in Young's song, he sings of a fork in the road ahead and not knowing what he is going to do. But he makes his thoughts clear in the closing lines of the song. Quote, there's a bailout coming, but it's not for you. It's for all those creeps hiding what they do. End quote.
Nice.
Yeah. All right. So A Fork in the Road is a 2010 film directed by Jim Koff. It's billed as a comedy suspense movie. Here's the synopsis from TV Guide. Quote, Will, an escaped convict, inadvertently takes refuge in a barn the same night as the owners, April and Martin, get into a terrible fight. A gunshot goes off inside the house. April drags Martin's body outside and discovers Will. He convinces her he is not there to harm her, but has witnessed the murder, so they must cooperate or both go to prison. The two take out to dispose of the body, only to find out he is not dead. The task of disposal turns into a kidnapping nightmare, and as the two try to navigate the turn of events, they find they must make some hard choices to keep from losing it all. End quote. In the trailer, it becomes very clear that Martin is, in fact, the bad guy of this whole situation. So, you see Will and April as the good guys in this. Although Will's more of an anti-hero, but yeah, maybe they're both anti-heroes, I guess.
Yeah.
So this next one is a book and a podcast and a website, but I'll talk about the book first. Fork in the Road, A Hopeful Guide to Food Freedom, is a 2021 book by Dr. Jen Unwin. I'll let the synopsis do the talking. Quote, Dr. Jen Unwin is a clinical psychologist and a lifelong carbohydrate addict. Fork in the Road guides you in a clear way through identifying if you have carbohydrate addiction, finding the motivation to change your life, understanding how to build the right daily eating plan, the strategies for long-term success, and where to go for more information and support. In this beautifully illustrated book, Jen teams up with top clinicians in the field and with creative low carbers who share what they have learned about freeing yourself from the emotional and physical dangers of overeating sugars, flours, and processed foods. Make today your fork in the road to health and food freedom. End quote. So I thought that was really interesting because in this, Dr. Unwin is talking about a decision in how you eat things, right? As if you're coming to this big moment, and she talks about carbohydrate as an addiction, and the idea is you've come to the moment that you say like, I need help to overcome this addiction, right? And definitely recognizing that you have a problem and you need assistance is a fork in the road moment, right? That's the moment. Do you ask for help or do you not ask for help, right? So that's definitely a fork in the road moment, and I think it's interesting that she's chosen that phrase to become pretty much the phrase of the whole thing. The website is forkintheroad.co.uk. She has more than just a book. The website has an entire ecosystem. It includes the Fork in the Road podcast. Here's the description from that. Quote, "Nothing is more inspiring than hearing the real-life stories of other people tackling the same problems as us. The Fork in the Road podcast is interviews with other sugar addicts who are in recovery. What was their fork in the road moment, and how did they beat the sugar stranglehold on their lives?" End quote. We are not doctors or experts, so you should not take your dieting advice from two nerdy researchers with a love of words and a penchant for getting off topic. You should probably take it from a bona fide expert on the subject. So that's all I would say on that front. So I can't comment on whether or not that whole thing is worthwhile or not. But, maybe it will help you. Who knows?
You never know. Sometimes people need to change in their thinking less than like maybe they've already gotten the advice and they just need help changing the way they think about it.
Right. All right, so Fork in the Road was a late January 2025 deferred resignation program offered by the United States government shortly after the inauguration of Donald Trump in his second term. It was meant as a way to reduce the size of the federal workforce by allowing employees to resign and still get paid through the end of the fiscal year. A fiscal year for the United States government runs October 1st through September 30th. So this process was touted by Elon Musk, who has some role in Trump's presidency, but it has been unclear what that role is. Musk has long been a fan of the phrase fork in the road, using a similar email subject line when he bought Twitter and then told the staff they should commit to an extremely hardcore work life or leave. He then fired many of its staff. In 2025, some of those staff were awarded severance by the U.S. court system after Musk initially refused to pay what was, according to the courts, legally owed to them. And I think that history coming out about the same time as the Fork in the Road email for the federal government with Musk's backing, I think that history certainly has caused concern among federal workers, considering the deferred resignation program. But Musk's overuse of the phrase doesn't stop there. He installed a giant 30-foot fork, like eating fork, near Tesla's autopilot office in Palo Alto, California in 2022. He had this to say about it, quote, "I love the inverse poetry of making metaphors literal," end quote. And I was just like, I think Musk may not understand the history of this phrase, which was literal for hundreds of years before it took on a metaphorical meaning and is still used literally today as well. But I don't think Musk has shown much of an understanding of history.
That right there is irony.
Right? I know. No, that's a great case of irony, yeah. So anyway, I have long enjoyed this phrase, but the association with Musk has really soured it for me for right now. Hopefully I'll be able to go back to enjoying this phrase because I do think it's a beautiful metaphor for making difficult choices in life. I just think sometimes too many people are paying for the privilege to force you into the decision they want, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
Well, that's about all we have time for today. If you have any thoughts on the show or pop culture references we should have included, reach out to us on Patreon, patreon.com/bunnytrailspod, or comment on our website, bunnytrailspod.com.
It's poll time. Recently, we asked our patrons about the application-based payment methods they use. PayPal was the most common answer, followed by Venmo. Others that were used included Apple Pay, Cash App, Google Pay, and Zelle. And we had a few patrons note that they don't use any app-based payments. They're probably the smart ones. Mary says, quote, I use only PayPal, Zelle, and Apple Pay now. Apple Pay for app purchases, Zelle to receive money, PayPal for general transactions. I fired Google and Cash App after people I know lost a bunch of money or time dealing with being hacked. I love the ease of the apps, but not the vulnerability. End quote.
That's great. Great point.
I love that she fired them.
I love the recognition that like there's ease and vulnerability, and you have to find the value judgment that's best for you in that.
Absolutely.
JGP said, quote, I'm so out of the loop when it comes to these sorts of things. I've used PayPal to pay for online things. I've never used it or any of the others as a payment app. End quote. I'm right there with you, JGP. Some of these I hadn't even heard of. Emily added, quote, I use money transfer apps to split the checks with friends or to pay vendors at arts and crafts fairs, end quote. And I guess that's how I use these too. If we split the bill when I'm traveling, if I buy a fundraising item from one of my nieces, then I'll Venmo the money to my sister, so that, they've got it. Or if I'm paying like a small vendor for something like at a farmer's market, I think I actually used it one time for the tattoo artist, because I didn't have the cash on me that I was hoping to have because I was going to go in and schedule something and they're like, we can do it right now. And I'm like, cool. Yeah. I wasn't ready for that, but all right. But I've never actually used for these to pay for something at a store. I get the vulnerability piece, but I think there's a benefit in not having your actual credit card or debit card information that's being given to the vendor, but you are instead giving that information to the app instead. So the question is, as Mary mentioned, what level of vulnerability are you comfortable with?
I've used PayPal, but only online to buy things on Etsy or other stores. Mm-hmm. The only one I've used in the sense that we've been talking about is Venmo. It's great for sending money back and forth with office folks when someone buys coffee or pays for lunch or something like that. Yeah. So that splitting the bill concept. But mine's set to not actually allow payments from my credit card. Like it has to use the balance or I have to put in my password to give approval.
Interesting.
So.
Yeah.
As a reminder, our silly polls mean absolutely nothing and are not scientifically valid, and patrons of all levels, including our free tiers, can take part. Head over to patreon.com/bunnytrailspod to take this week's poll. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week. Until then, remember,
words belong to their users.